We are so excited to hear from Liza and Campbell, their homeschooling journey. So Liza and Campbell, will you tell us a little bit about your journey to homeschooling?
Well, when Campbell was going into 5th grade, her teacher for the visually impaired had moved away. And so we offered to homeschool for a year until they could find a TBI. And so we started with that 1 year and just really enjoyed it and kept going and ended up homeschooling for 9 years. Right.
Yes.
And I'm still homeschooling her little sister who's 14. So I guess we're just going to keep going. 1 year turned into many.
Yes.
That's awesome. So I know you guys get tons of questions, and hopefully through the next couple of videos, we can answer some of the probably the most common questions. So if we can answer some of those for some of the folks who are watching. But first question for you both, how did you choose your curriculum? How did you assign work, set a schedule, and create deadlines?
Well, first of all, we chose many curriculums over the years. There's nothing is ever permanent, I guess, in homeschool. You can choose and then try it. And if it doesn't work, choose something else. But that being said, it is expensive to do that. So we tried not to do it too often. And I was advised by another homeschool mom that you can make anything work. You know, kids can learn anything from everything. So we would usually just try to make it work. But as for homeschooling a Braille reader, you know, you can't, the selection is a lot smaller of what is accessible for a Braille reader. So I couldn't just order workbooks, you know, like I can for my sighted child. So we usually lean more toward a lit-based curriculum. We would use Charlotte Mason type stuff, not strictly Charlotte Mason, but we enjoyed things with where you read actual living, what they call living books instead of textbooks. But also with Bookshare, you can access textbooks as well. So we had a lot of choices. We loved Guest Hollow. They're a lit-based curriculum. And probably each subject would have how many books to read, you think?
Oh, I don't know.
About 20 or 30.
At least.
For each, like, so for biology, instead of reading one textbook, you would read 30 books about different topics of biology.
Mm-hmm.
And not huge books. Some of them were big, but then they would give you a schedule, you know, read this on this day and this part of this book on this day. And then they would have links to videos that you could also watch to go along with it. And typically Campbell would try to do the readings herself using Bookshare. And usually a screen reader. You didn't read much Bookshare stuff with your Braille display, right?
Right.
At that time. So she used Voice Dream Reader most of the time. And which is a huge perk because she can read really fast with that. So how many words a minute do you think you read with the?
Right now, I'd say about 550.
So in Braille, you're probably
maybe 80. I'm
80
a
words
fairly
a minute.
slow Braille reader.
So, you know, it kind of levels the playing field a little bit to have that tool in your toolbox to be able to read with a screen reader.
Yeah, I will say that now that a lot of resources are being digitized, the selection for Braille readers for curricula, especially for math and science, is probably not as small as it was
back then.
Because a lot of online math textbooks already have accessible math. I don't know how many of them are free, but some of them you can access. And so what I often do now in college, when I have an online resource, especially for math, is I'll read the textual parts with my screen reader, JAWS, on my computer. And then when I get to, you know, some equations, I'll read with my Braille display because it comes up in Nemeth Braille. So I think more resources are being made available where that's possible. I will say right now, Bookshare does not offer good support for math and science books and Braille displays, but online resources do.
Sometimes. I think Pearson is supposed to be very accessible.
Yes, right? Yes, Pearson is very accessible. I worked with them actually in one of my college classes for my college biology dual enrollment.
Yeah, and so math is always the big question because you can't really do that with a screen reader. So we actually borrowed books from the resource center for our state. So I guess her IEP meeting was usually in March, and we would plan the next year. And I would request like whatever, say pre-algebra, and they would just try to find whatever they could find in Braille, which was probably actually easier for them than if she'd been in the public school classroom, because they would have to use whatever the teacher was using, where we could just use whatever they could find. So for math, that's typically what we did. And sometimes it was good, and sometimes the books were 20 years old, but we would make it work. And obviously it turned out okay. She did fine and scored well on ACT and all that stuff. So as far as the assigning work and the scheduling stuff goes, I think our first year we were a little more tried to do more like what a public school classroom would look like, as far as, you do this subject at this time and this subject at this time. We tried that for a little bit. But our schedules are so crazy. I worked outside of the home at that time, and I have another one, and she was in a Montessori preschool. So we were always driving back and forth, and Campbell would do all kinds of stuff in the car. We just kind of homeschool wherever. So it was really laid back, I guess. And what we would do is take the curriculum and divide it, just do the math, like, well, how many chapters are there and how many weeks do you have to do it? And how much do you need to get done each week? And it doesn't always mean doing every subject every day, like you would in public school. Sometimes especially with math early on, because it was a lot of repetition, sometimes she would only do math like one day a week, because we would just do the chapter test at the end. And if she didn't miss any problems, then what was the point of doing all that homework for that chapter,
Yeah.
So we kind of just played it by ear, and she had a big hand in deciding what she wanted to do each day, and deciding how much of each subject to do.
Right. It's more like a college schedule than a middle school or high school schedule, I would say, especially in saying, you may not do every subject every day. I would tend to try to reevaluate my, how we had divided up everything every month or so. So reevaluate my syllabus to make sure I was on track. And if I wasn't, I, sometimes would do the math again and divide it again.
Because stuff comes up, and that's the good part of homeschooling is, if a trip comes available, or you can go somewhere with, like, my husband traveling, we could go with him somewhere, then we could just go, we didn't have to stress too much about it. As far as assignments go, that's kind of funny because we didn't really do a lot of assignments. I know that sounds ridiculous, but honestly, I didn't grade a lot of things. Like, we had a lot of conversations about what she was learning.
Mhm.
She had questions, we would go over things. And then just if she learned something nerdy that she enjoyed, we would talk about it, and we listened to audiobooks in the car. And of course that was conversation based. And people are like, well, how did you evaluate grades? Well, we worked on mastery. So if she did a math work and missed problems, she would go back and fix them. And honestly, from like 5th grade to 8th grade, she might have missed 5 problems ever, so
Because it was so much repetition.
it was a lot of repetition. And then when she got into pre-algebra, about halfway through pre-algebra, you started new material.
Yeah.
Right. And then even then, you're learning at your own pace. So it's not really like we didn't do exams. I mean, she did in homeschool co-ops, she did some exams.
Mhm.
But we didn't do that at home. And I think that freaks some people out sometimes because you're so accustomed to that style of learning, but it works out fine with us. Now, my other child, her math curriculum has a chapter test at the end, but she takes it and then she grades it herself and then goes back to see what she missed, and we talk about it. But it's a lot easier with just 2 kids. I mean, you don't really have to give a big exam to evaluate how they're doing.
Right. Once I got into high school, especially junior year, which is when I took my first AP exams, my cousin is an AP English teacher, and so I would send her my papers and have her evaluate them. And when I got into more advanced math, I actually sent my work to my dad's former calculus teacher for a while. And then later on, a calculus tutor that I had myself. And we would talk about that. And then I took some dual enrollment classes at a community college as well. And of course, those had homework and exams and everything, but those weren't a significant struggle. I mean, I was used to the sort of flexibility of a college-like schedule. So in a way, it was a bit easier than it had been before, because I wasn't having to come up with the syllabus.
Yeah, she probably had someone else in charge. Yeah.
You mentioned some curriculum in regards to language arts, but what about what curriculum you used for the other subject areas?
So the one thing I remember for US history, I took it both in 5th grade and my junior year. So in 5th grade, I read all of the American Girl books, like the historical ones. And I read several other historical fiction books. And then we watched a documentary called America, the Story of Us. That had several different, it was like a docu-series, I guess. And then another docu-series called The Men Who Built America, which was about the Industrial Revolution. So we did several things like that. In my junior year, when I took US history and then took the AP exam, I kind of worked with the College Board's syllabus for AP US history, but we used Guest Hollow, which we mentioned before. They have an AP, or not AP, but they have a US history curriculum that basically covers the AP US history syllabus. So I read the books that were on that curriculum. And then we actually have a friend who is a retired AP US history teacher. And a few weeks before my exam, I would just go to his house and we would just talk about US history. And he would tell me all the stuff that, he knew that I might have missed, and ask me questions and that kind of thing. So that's what we did for that. And then chemistry and math and biology, we did use Braille textbooks from the school system that were provided, but we also used Guest Hollow for chemistry and biology, which had both fiction and nonfiction books to kind of supplement the material. Same with physics. So basically, we just used a lot of literature-based things.
And for English, we used a lot of Brave Writer.
Oh, that's right.
For
Yes.
years too. And they were lit guides that we really enjoyed. So each, say once a month, the way the schedule works, you would have a book that you would read together as a family. And then you would have weekly copy work and then activities to do. And then at the end, they have this thing called Party School where you celebrate the book in some way, whether it's just to watch the movie version or actually have a party. Like when we read Series of Unfortunate Events, we actually had a party here and themed, with that. So it was a great curriculum too. We enjoyed a lot.
Yes.
And it was great because I have a 6-year age gap between my two kids. So it was nice to be able to read one book together, and kind of keep us interacting with each other instead of this is your work and this is your work, all day long. So